Hey, hey, Red May, ready to go all the way to June and around the world today with bottlenecks, choke points, and supply chains. Logistics is what we're going to talk about today. But before we get to today's panel, I want to clue you in about what we've got coming for the next few days. You can subscribe, and you should, to Red May TV at YouTube, and you'll get all of this sent to you. But if you haven't subscribed yet, let me start by saying that we have another panel today at 6 p.m. called The Political Economy of COVID-19. Radhika Desai is going to give an analysis of what has happened so far in the economy and what we can look at the global economy and what we can look forward to in the future. At tomorrow at 1 p.m., we have Socialism After Sanders and Shelter in Place. Excuse me. Jeremy Gilbert has a new book called 21st Century Socialism, and he's going to talk about it with Olivia Cappy-Smith, Hannah Atkinson, Alyssa Battistoni, Nick Mitchell, and Sarah Mason. Okay, and at 6 tomorrow, we have Belabored, a podcast of labor journalists Sarah Jaffe and Michelle Chen, and they'll be talking to Cal Winslow, who has a book on the Seattle General Strike of 1919. On Monday at 1 p.m., Communism or Neo-Feudalism, a kind of a re-transformation of socialism, barbarism from Rosa Luxemburg. Jody Dean poses that question, and Jason Reed and Eva Chernyevsky will respond to it. And at 5 p.m. we have After Geoengineering, where Dan Denver of Jacobin's The Dig interviews Holly Jean Buck about her new book from Verso. A lot of good stuff. To keep doing this, we need money. I will be crass. Give us your money. Go to our website, click donate. We depend on your kindness, or go to the YouTube description of this event and click on the link. We're up over $3,000, but we have a ways to go. So keep feeding the money. And now I'd like to turn it over to our moderator today, Spencer Cox, who's a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, who I met when he was organizing at Amazon. Spencer.
Well, thanks, Philip, for the handover. And I'm really excited about the panel that we have today. Thank you, Red May, for continuing to put together a great group of people to discuss some really central issues to kind of the left movement today. Today, we are joined by some eminent scholars who have been studying logistics, warehousing, and choke points. We will be going in kind of the order set up by the panel, and we'll be, hold on one second, I'm having some technical difficulties. We're going to be
I do want to, I'm sorry, step in for a second and give a shout out to Dara Orenstein, who couldn't join us today for sickness in the family. Hope everything is going well. Dara, we miss you.
Thank you, Philip. I just lost all of my stuff. I'm sorry about this. Hold on. So we're going to be starting today with Lale Khalili, who's sorry, I lost all of my, Lale, can you start us off? I'll do introductions once I can actually find
That's fine.
appropriate documentation. I'm sorry about that. That was really sloppy.
Not at all. And I'm going to go on ahead and introduce myself as well. I'm Lale Khalili, and I'm a professor of international politics in London at Queen Mary University of London. And I've recently had a book published. In fact, I actually spoke to the wonderful people at Red May and to Phil about a month ago, talking about the book and also about how I came to that project. But I want to start off by talking a little bit about the way that today's sort of events, the pandemic, and everything else that's going along with it, is actually in some ways transforming, but in many other ways actually intensifying the conditions of oppression, of the conditions of containment, of the conditions of labor repression, and of regimes of exploitation, environmental and otherwise, that had actually been in operation even before the pandemic started. Part of the reason that I want to start with the pandemic is because I think that there has been a lot of hopeful thinking about how the pandemic might change things irretrievably. And I think that in some ways, I quite like the idea of the hopefulness of there being a massive transformation, a massive shift in the way that logistics operate, in the way that warehousing operates, in the way that maritime trade and other forms of trade, trucking and rail, etc., operate. But I also worry that in many ways that hopefulness seems to kind of depend on the accident of the pandemic, on the chance of it, and also on the kinds of changes that have happened in a temporary way. And I really want to sort of focus on a few things in order to show that perhaps it's really good to temper that hopefulness also with an understanding that without some degree of political mobilization by public, and without some deep awareness of the way that politics actually underlies these kinds of logistical transformations that we're seeing in the age of pandemic, those transformations won't come about, those positive transformations won't come about. So I want to start first of all with oil, which actually usually is not considered in the discussion of supply chains or logistics. But obviously, oil transportation, petroleum transportation, and the transportation of petroleum products and their production elsewhere is a fundamental part of logistics, not only because petroleum, of course, fuel is the fundamental basis of fuel oil, and the vast majority of the world's ships, the vast majority of its trucks, and most of its rail operates still on fuels derived from petroleum. But also because the making of the objects that are transported in bulk ships or in container ships are also dependent on that fuel going in all sorts of places, including obviously the production of plastics. But a lot of the stuff that's transported on container ships, often in refrigerated containers, also tend to be actually petrochemical materials, stuff that are derived from fossil fuels. Now, one of the interesting conjunctions that has happened at the same time as the pandemic is that at the very moment where we saw a drop in demand for oil, we also saw an instance of macho competition between Saudi Arabia and Russia in trying to pump out more oil in order to be able to control the market in oil. And so what we ended up with was this massive glut in oil. In fact, these fascinating maps that show where tankers are showed that ports near, in places where there are lots of refineries, for example, the US Gulf Coast, southern parts of the US Pacific coast, where there are lots of refineries in California, and places like Rotterdam, Antwerp, and in fact, around the Gulf itself, you saw a kind of an intensification of tankers carrying oil. At the same moment, I think many of your listeners remember that for a brief moment, for a couple of days, the futures prices of oil dropped below zero, meaning that the traders were actually wanting people to take the oil off their hands rather than taking delivery of oil because the storage was filled. And so when people started seeing this, and importantly, it's also important to note that while this was also happening, the price of oil had dropped so low that some of the forms of oil extraction, which are extremely capital intensive, for example, fracking, the companies that were involved in these fracking businesses ended up going out of business. So one of the striking things has been the number of various oil companies involved in these kinds of heavy capital, heavy technology extraction mechanisms so many of them have actually filed for bankruptcy. So seeing this has been really interesting because, of course, a lot of people are saying, wow, this is it. This is the end of the moment of fossil fuel. This is it. We're going to be moving to green technologies. And of course, I really want something like that to happen. It's a wonderful thing if we can see this kind of a transformation arriving. And certainly, as long as the price of oil is low, it's going to be really hard to use such incredibly ecologically destructive methods of extraction as fracking, which is far more horrendous than most other forms of straight up extraction in places where oil is more plentiful, like, for example, in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf Basin. But what I wanted to also point out is that one of the interesting things that has come out of this has been that despite our fond wishes for the transformation of the energy industry and a shift towards green energy, we're seeing that governments throughout the world are actually doing everything they can to bolster the fossil fuel industry. And one of the most striking news items that I saw was that, in fact, the US was wiping away the debt of a number of these oil companies that were going to be extracting, some of them in national parks in the US. So places that are supposed to be protected ecologically. So the US was actually wiping the debt of these companies or giving them or wiping the fees for them, which was required for them to go in and extract, while at the same time calling in the debt for green energy. And to me, that was actually an incredibly striking moment because it seemed to me that the sort of shoring up of the order as usual, the shoring up of the status quo ex ante seems to be something that many of the governments are attempting precisely because they're terrified of the shifts that, for example, a shift to green energy would require. The second element of this that I also want to point out is that, again, we also see, and I'm going to quickly wrap with this because I think I'm coming up to my 5 minutes. One of the things that is quite striking also, no pun intended, is that we're seeing a lot more talk of general strikes, and my focus is on the maritime industry, but even in maritime industry we see talk of strikes aboard ships in particular. So this to me is really interesting because there's a insurance club, used to be called the Strike Club, but it's now called a Standard Club, which actually tracks the number of strikes that take place at ports and aboard ships. And I have been subscribing to their newsletter for years and years and years. And one of the things that has been really interesting for me over the course of these many years has been that while at every newsletter that arrives, there are a significant number of strikes somewhere in the world, which this insurance company is insuring against, there's almost never been a strike aboard the ships. And I think that the fact that maritime workers have been in some senses made such that they cannot engage in strike action aboard ships has been one of the devastating effects of many of the transformations in the shipping industry. Now, one of the things that has happened is precisely because of all the borders being closed and because many maritime workers, seafarers, are as well as crew members and things like cruise ships, are trapped aboard ships which cannot go anywhere. And some of these crew members are ill. Some have had to be helicoptered off the ships that are at anchor somewhere where they cannot move. There is now talk of strikes among them. And what I'm curious about is whether or not a moment will come where organizing will go back to the levels that we used to see among maritime workers back at the end of the 19th century, all the way through to the middle of the 20th century, when seafarers and sailors were some of the most militant workers anywhere. And we saw a kind of a decline of that. And so it would be interesting. But again, for this to happen, we cannot depend on the conditions of work being as horrendous as they are, and some degree of mobilization and organizing and not being on the back foot is necessary. And that is what I'm actually hoping to see in the coming months. Thanks very much. Over to you, Spencer.
Great. Thank you, Lale. That was a really stirring introduction. We're now going to pivot over to Charmaine Chua. Charmaine is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She has a forthcoming book coming out called Logistics Leviathan, Circulation Empire and the Trans-Pacific Supply Chain, which explores the expansion of US-China commercial trade through the rise of logistics. Handing it over to you, Charmaine.
Thanks, Spencer, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us on a Saturday morning or afternoon or night for all of you on a weekend. I'm really happy to be here talking with these incredible scholars whose work I continuously learn from. And I think I want to try to keep my comments pretty brief today and just try to speak to one question that I've been asking in my work, but that I also feel is sort of particularly important in these times, which is, what does an anti-racist or an internationalist struggle on the terrain of logistics look like? So for those of you who are, attending this panel and may not have read already Sandro and Deb and Lale's incredible work on logistics, whether you have or you haven't, you might know that since the 1950s and 60s, this turn to just-in-time supply chains has sought to sort of increasingly integrate both integrate supply chains and globalize them across the space of the international, and has pushed companies to actually shorten supply links and tighten the coordination of delivery and warehousing and transport. And so as Deborah Cowan has shown, this changes sort of not only the delivery process, but the production process as well, right? So the important thing I think that we've learned from Deb's work is that logistics is not at all something separate from the production process, but is actually folds industrial and merchant capital into each other. And so one of the central threads that I sort of try to think through, and which I think actually helps us understand the pandemic moment, is the ways in which I think it's important to understand logistics supply chains, not only as a temporal form, right? So I think a lot of people focus on the idea of logistics as just in time. And in fact, during the pandemic moment, a lot of, I think, the media focus on what's been happening in that sector in the global north, at least in the US, has been on how Amazon workers are affected and the increasing and incredibly inspiring strikes in Amazon warehouses. And a lot of that focus has been on the sort of shift to e-commerce that is necessitated by the fact that we're all staying at home. I think this is a chief and really crucial part of the puzzle, but I think, we need to think not only about the temporal, but the spatial as well, when we think about the internationalist spread of the supply chain, right? So one of the things that I think is important to remember is that supply chains are not just in time, but in places where the manufacturing is actually happening, we are looking at places that are not just looking for the fastest or shortest chain, but also the lowest piece price. And what's been happening in sort of driving down the cost of production is that in places like China, Shenzhen, which used to be the kind of industrial sector zone that moved goods to the port, has actually increased in the cost of labor over time, right, since the 1970s. And so manufacturing has actually moved inland into places like Wuhan, which used to be a center for the manufacturing of fur, silk, and sort of small commodities, but today is actually quite a central space for the manufacturing of auto manufacturing. And so I think one of the things to kind of understand and think about is the spatial extension of the supply chain and the ways in which it's necessitated this spread. But the other thing that I try to do in my work and my thinking is, and this is something that Deb, Lale, and I have written about, is to think about logistics not only as this kind of specific sector or domain of industry, but as a kind of extension of different kinds of calculative rationalities of logistics, right? And Sandro Mazadra has written with Manuela Bozagiev of this process as actually a process of logistification, the extension of aspects of logistics into other domains of life, like migrant flows, et cetera. And one of the things I think I've been thinking about a lot is the ways in which we increasingly see during the pandemic this kind of false equivalence between profits and lives in this moment, right? Where the containment of people within their houses or the mandated shutting of the economy to save lives is now being seen as something that is counterproductive to economic life. And increasingly, with Trump's concern about reopening the economy, we see this kind of language, right, where the need to prioritize the flow of commerce comes to take precedence over the safety of people, to the extent, I think, that Trump and libertarians and right-wing protests have been casting, in fact, the opening of supply chains and the need for new, continued economic mobility as a proxy for the well-being of populations, right? We see this rhetoric of how it is that, oh, if we keep the economy flowing, that will actually save more lives than if we make sure that everyone's staying at home and being safe. And so I'm sort of really interested in the ways in which this calculated rationality comes out of a larger neoliberal movement, but is articulated in a particular kind of logistical language about flows and connections. And one of the things that I've really wanted to think about in my work is to actually ask this question of what that means for other forms of imaginaries that were rife at the time that logistics rose. And so, I think connection narratives actually conceal the kinds of displacements, dispossessions, and containments that Lale precisely pointed out, right? That access to economic mobility actually gets cast as a solution to the violence of racial capitalism. And so in the current book project that I'm working through, one of the things I actually want to think about is that the way that we've kind of tried to term the rise of logistics in the 1960s is through the language of the so-called logistics revolution. And one of the things that I've tried to think through, particularly in the 1960s, is to look at other possible forms of economic mobility that were present at the time, principally through the Third World Project and the Third World Internationalist movement. Now, at the time of that logistics rose, and this is something that Vijay Prasad writes in a really short but wonderful essay called The Time of the Popular Front. At the time that logistics rose, right, as a way to kind of spread the supply chain over the globe, what the Third World Project was really trying to do, articulated through the Bandung Conference and through a growing non-aligned movement, is that more than 54% of the world, newly decolonized, were starting to think about the question of what it would mean to realign politics and economics along an anti-colonial and anti-capitalist vision. And I can say more about the sort of specific details of this later, but really what Prasad argues is that rather than allowing import substitute industrialization and methods forwarded by people like Raoul Prebisch in as early as the 1949s, right, which advocated replacing foreign imports with domestic production to kind of shore up the possibility of the nationalization of industry as a development method. What happened with logistics is that it enabled the world to spread and internationalize supply chains more quickly and in more fragmented ways around the world by lowering shipping and freight costs so that you could, in some sense, delegitimize the need for the nationalization of industry, right? And Prasad actually says that as the Third World Project arose, the West, with the control of logistical technologies, the West could actually monopolize long distance trade as a way to exercise control over the end-to-end supply chain, right? So if a state then nationalizes a factory, it doesn't actually matter anymore because it wouldn't be able to capture the entire production process. It would only be a singular node within a much larger and fragmented supply chain. And so part of what I want to argue and think through today and sort of, into the future is that the logistics revolution was really not a revolution at all, right? In the sense that we think about revolutions as upheavals or overthrows of the dominant class. In fact, the logistics revolution, as I argue, was actually a logistics counter-revolution. It was a counter-revolution in the sense that what it worked to do was actually dissipate what were immensely potential energies of third worldist and anti-colonial solidarities at precisely the time that it offered a kind of political technology of rule. So I might maybe stop there and elaborate a little bit later on, but one of the ways that I think this is important today is that if we think about logistics as a counter-revolutionary technology, we might follow someone like Jody Melamed, who says that racial capitalism is actually a technology of anti-relationality, right? And if you put those two together, I think that thinking about the counter-revolutionary tendencies actually allows us to understand the ways that logistics dissipates precisely the kinds of terrains of internationalist struggle that we are seeing emerge and surge in these particular moments. And one of the things that I think is increasingly being articulated actually from both the left and the right is that this moment of the pandemic is showing that there is a possible future of deglobalization. So we're seeing this from the right and from economic interests in some really interesting ways, right? In 2016, the JP Morgan CEO actually said that deglobalization was one of the corporation's biggest risks. And then on the other side, you have the left saying deglobalization is a really fertile strategy for thinking about the future of more reliant and resilient supply chains. And I think it's really hard to romanticize the latter without taking into account the way that supply chain managers and financiers in the former are actually thinking about the deglobalized movement as a way to make supply chains more resilient and more sort of stretchable to respond to things like the pandemic. I'll stop there maybe and say a little bit more about what I think this means for struggle in the Q&A.
Thank you, Charmaine. Love the idea of the logistics counter-revolution. It's a really interesting intervention. Thank you for that. We're going to switch over now to Deb Cohen. Deb is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. She is the author of The Deadly Life of Logistics and co-editor of Digital Lives in the Global City, Contesting Infrastructures. She's also been a great influence on a large amount of people who study the infrastructure of logistics and studying logistics as a whole as an industry. So it's great to hear from her today.
Thank you, Spencer, and thank you so much, Philip, for organizing us, and to Red May. What a extraordinary month of events. I'm just amazed, and have been spending a lot of time with the ones that have already taken place, and took notes on all the ones to come. So thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this amazing set of events. And also thank you to Lale and Charmaine, and I'm sure to Sandro as well, when I hear from Sandro. There's lots that's been said already that I'm going to try and already incorporate into my thoughts, but I have prepared some thoughts, and I'll just share them with you now, and hopefully we can pick up in the discussion how to think across our different contributions today. So today, as I think others have mentioned already, we're seeing a kind of newfound popular clarity regarding the power of logistics and the problem of global supply chains in the context of the pandemic's disruptions. From initial concerns about whether shutdowns in China would create disruption to especially Western consumption, to panics over toilet paper in particular and supplies, the hoarding of essentials, to the crisis of PPE, including some quite dramatic accounts, for instance, in the New England Journal of Medicine, of hospitals literally sending decoy trucks and fighting the FBI and Department of Homeland Security to get PPE from the port to the emergency room in the United States. Pandemic pedagogy has involved mass education about some of the very basic tenets of supply chain capitalism. In a recent piece, Kim Moody suggests that, quote, the pandemic has graphically demonstrated the centrality of the human networks that keep the global supply chain moving. That is, all those who produce the goods and those that bring them to the factory, the hospital, the supermarket, or your self-isolating home. He further suggests that the hands of labor that make, move, and deliver our essential goods and services can also stop them. And I think that's kind of a truism in much of the scholarship, but also the organizing and activism around supply chains and logistics. So it was largely fears about disruption to the supply chains that led to the designation of the essential worker. I think this category of essential worker may have initially or briefly seemed like an opening, the possibility for the revalorization of hyper-exploited precarious workers who are primarily of color. But instead, I think what we've increasingly come to see are corporations performing platitudes in gratitude to their essential workers, calling them heroes in PR stunts, but really refusing meaningful shifts in financial compensation, sick leave, or even access to basic health and safety like PPE. It's not an accident that the world's first trillionaire is a leader in the logistics sector, and perhaps not a surprise that he and others like him have grabbed even more wealth through the pandemic, largely in the hyper-exploitation of that category of worker, making the abundance of labor actions in these sectors additionally important. This is all critical, but I want to suggest that the problem of logistics also runs much deeper in this moment, and unearthing its subterranean forms might point towards an even more capacious terrain for politics and political action. Specifically, I think it might help us to think about disruption within a wider frame of racial capitalism, so thinking very much with my two colleagues who just spoke, and help us forge direct connections to strategies of refusal and approaches invested in provisioning otherwise, so coupling disruption as a tactic, not just as a condition, with other kinds of political modalities. In other words, I hope some additional reflections on logistics might help us think about the necessary relationships between deliberate disruptions in the context of logistics labor actions and supplying the necessities of social reproduction otherwise, through and beyond the work of mutual aid, for instance. And there was an amazing conversation a couple nights ago between Robin Kelly, Assad Haider, and Sarah Jaffe, I think with Verso. There's so many wonderful online things happening these days, I can't even remember, but where they talked specifically about some of the tensions that sometimes emerge between kind of workplace-based strategies and mutual aid. So I've been thinking a lot about that over the last few months. If I had more time today, I'd also suggest that engaging logistics in this more fulsome way makes the necessary connections between logistics or counter logistics, border abolitionism, counter logistics, and anti-colonialism explicit. This deeper problem of logistics speaks to how this calculative management and martial science has remade society and space beyond just transportation and distribution. So some of this goes back to what we maybe used to call the revolution in logistics, but following Charmaine 2025 minutes ago, I should probably maybe rethink that as the counter-revolution in logistics. And that also made me think alongside Jody Malamed and others to think about Manu Karuka's really beautiful book on where he engages the question of counter-sovereignty in some detail. So I think that's really compelling. So anyways, I'm going to say some of this goes back to the counter-revolution in logistics, which is sometimes known in the writing as the revolution in logistics, that took shape in the post-World War II period, which saw the deliberate harnessing of military methods of supplying the front for corporate operations. A profound transformation took shape conceptually in terms of how cost and value were calculated, that both responded to and produced profound transformation in the material organization of the economy. So that's kind of old hat for some of us, but it's worth kind of repeating, I think, because sometimes I see logistics kind of reduced to distribution in a way that I think is not as compelling as it could be. So before the revolution, logistics was really a military art of getting supplies to the battlefield or the front. After the revolution, what became known as logistics was a management science of materials movement throughout the production and distribution process in both the corporate and military sector. So logistics transformed not just distribution or transportation, but racial capitalism itself, its relationship to questions of circulation and containment, and to matters of life and premature death. So let me offer just a brief example from one of the key sectors to be impacted by the pandemic in profound and diagnostic ways. The meat supply chain has been ground zero on Turtle Island for outbreaks, with striking impacts on precarious, often migrant workers who are also mostly of color. These outbreaks occur because of working conditions and productivity demands that make meaningful distancing impossible, because of a lack of provisioning of PPE, and because of the social determinants of health for these particular precarious populations. The outbreaks led to plant closures and a major loss of abattoir capacity, creating enormous bottlenecks in the profoundly industrialized and logistical meat sector. In the US and elsewhere, the infection and premature death of processing plant workers, not only their labor actions, has been a source of supply chain disruption. And the massive and not at all humane culls of animal life have been one of the gruesome costs. This is all too real, but I think we can move even deeper when we see that logistics does not simply come into play with the movement of, let's say, pigs from the farm to the slaughterhouse, but with the very design of the pig itself. So for instance, the IKEA flat pack that has really reshaped the design of all IKEA furniture to fit supply chain capitalism, designed for the logic of efficient transport and reduced paid assembly work. Many of you will probably be familiar with kind of Herculean efforts to assemble a Billy bookcase only to have it like collapse because of the really shoddy construction and materials like less than a year later. So likewise, the logistics of swine production have reshaped the very form of the pig to enhance the supply chain. For supply chain management, the pig itself is hardly a life form at all. It's rather one temporary stage of pork as a commodity in the cycle of value realization and profit maximization. The pig has been dramatically refigured as a life form towards that end. Swine hips, for instance, are now standardized to easily fit the machines of slaughter. In fact, in the corporate meat sector, every aspect of the cycle of pig life has been reorganized by supply chain management and its software so that the pig fits the system. And you can see some of this at swinemanagement.com if you're interested, a gruesome site. As one key industry textbook explains, quote, logistics, not science, is the underpinning of a successful breeding policy. This includes everything from ovulation synchronization for reproductive efficiency to the timing of insemination and the weaning of sows to fit trucking schedules themselves organized to maximize efficiency at processing facilities, otherwise known as slaughterhouses. So with this admittedly gruesome example, I want to remind us that logistics includes, but cannot be limited to questions of distribution or sectors that seem associated with that end game work. Logistics is about managing materials movement into, through, and beyond production It is a management and martial science of movement that in the corporate sector at least has the goal of maximizing the circulation of capital. Key here is that managing movement necessarily includes containment and bordering. To create smooth flow and for supply chain capitalism to reproduce, literal and metaphorical pipelines need to be created and protected through metal or concrete, through law and regulation, or through police and military force. So logistics has a very long history in managing materials in the context of war, colonialism, and slavery, where the boundaries, like the very boundaries between commodity and life, are not at all secure. So Moten and Harney famously locate the genesis of modern logistics in the slave ship. And there's an emerging literature on prison logistics and carceral forms being explicitly invoked in this moment in direct response to the various forms of containment and policing of the pandemic. So all this to say that in the context, that logistics in the context of COVID-19 includes, but also well exceeds, getting supplies to hospitals and to quarantine households. The very organization of quarantine itself, I want to suggest, is logistical. As many have observed, the household and the nation, and in particular the household kind of as metric for a nation, have become the prime epidemiological and economic units of pandemic response. The household has long been a target of supply chain managers, with Amazon and Google creating technologies specifically to open up this unpredictable, intimate, and hitherto inaccessible space to supply chain management. So of course, there's radical inequality within and between households, and this is not incidental but essential to the logistical management of quarantine. Some households can stay home while others must work to ensure the other group's comfort and well-being. The racial disparities have now been widely commented upon, especially in the context of anti-Blackness and the ongoing violence of settler colonialism and Indigenous dispossession, wherein the house and the household is key. So before I wrote BCE, and I think I mean before the COVID era, I think that's what I mean here, the US was in the midst of a deeply racialized housing crisis, as many Black urbanists from Ta-Nehisi Coates, Kanga-Yamada Taylor, Nimoy Lewis, and others have documented. Housing has long been key to the sculpting of segregation, racial wealth divides, and the Black and brown geographies of coronavirus's destructive path. The map of COVID-19, as Jaffe said in this Verso event the other night, is literally a map of redlining. Likewise, perennial water and housing crisis in Indigenous communities underpin the ravages of the pandemic on the Navajo Nation and in other Indigenous communities. So in any case, we can imagine a supply chain capitalism that actually thrives through quarantine, where the traffic of the urban, one of the kind of main Achilles heels of logistics in an urban context, is contained. Alexa could be queen and Echo could be king. We do not have to imagine a world where Amazon's Bezos becomes the world's first trillionaire. As I said earlier, it's already here. There are also direct ties here between the contemporary logistics of worker surveillance that Anya Kangiser has examined that are directly relevant to the real-time tracking and tracing that we've seen in response to the pandemic, especially in contexts like South Korea. I would not yet say that we're seeing a kind of logistical spatial fix emerge through quarantine, but we are seeing experimentation with a set of gruesome and racialized forms. So what does all this mean for justice, disruption, and transformation in this moment? Well, approaching contemporary supply chain capitalism through disruption, and especially the disruptions created by the labor actions that might build social and economic power of precarious, racialized, and seemingly disposable workers, is of course key. We need to also think, however, about provisioning otherwise, about building autonomous infrastructures that can support the immediate needs of survival and that can also create longer term transformation. So we need to invest in building infrastructure otherwise, as Winona Duke and I have recently suggested in a piece, or what she might term, we have to build beyond Wendigo infrastructure. So the importance of labor actions at Instacart, for instance, need to be held together with the creation of alternative food systems. And I think in this moment, like so many people are thoughtfully drawing on the work of groups like the Black Panthers and their survival programs as models for mutual aid work. And I think that's phenomenal and wonderful. But the Panthers, and especially like one of the former party chairs, Elaine Brown, were also critical in the food sovereignty and urban agricultural projects in the East Bay area that have helped to build meaningful alternatives to the food supply chain that are vibrant and growing to this day. So this divide between like mutual aid and labor kinds of approaches or supply chain approaches, I don't think we need to maintain. Likewise, we could also look at the inspiring indigenous food and seed sovereignty movements across the continent, even or especially in remote and northern nations. So finally, if we see this problem, not simply the problem of logistics, not simply in the kind of last mile of logistic systems that I think, you know, sometimes our focus on just distribution and transportation supports, but in the very calculative logics that underpin and organized supply chain capitalism, I think in ways that Charmaine was also pointing to, that underpin and organize supply chain capitalism as racial capitalism, then we clearly need to fight to shift power within that system with the goal of its transformation, while we also need to cultivate new economies rooted in provisioning rather than accumulation. In other words, if this devastating moment can be transformed into a portal towards something better, as Arundhati Roy anticipates, we need all good hands on deck. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Deb. That was really inspiring. We're going to finish with our last panelist and then go to kind of a discussion section. We're hearing from Sandro Mezzadra, who's an associate professor of political theory at the University of Bologna. He is the author with Brett Nielsen of Border as Method, or the Multiplication of Labor, and also The Politics of Operations, Excavating Contemporary Capitalism. Thank you, Sandro, for joining us. You also need to unmute.
Thank you for having me and for giving me the opportunity of being part of this amazing Red May program. Just a couple of words to introduce myself. My work on logistics, as well as on other topics, is not a merely individual work. It is rather part of a dense fabric of research, collaborations, and political complicities around the world, which include my collaborative writing with Brett Nielsen from Sydney, but also my relation with an amazing collective of younger scholars and activists into the black box. Check the website. It is worth doing that if you are interested in logistics and logistical struggles. They have a manifesto where, among other things, they speak extensively of the counter-revolution in logistics. I think, first of all, it is important to stress that over the last years, logistics has provided scholars and activists in many parts of the world with a lens for the critical analysis of contemporary capitalism writ large. This means that flows and mobility of staff, supply chains, as well as bottlenecks and choke points enable an analysis of capitalism even beyond the strategically relevant sector of logistics. And this is a point we should keep in mind in our discussion. Let me make just 3 short introductory points. Firstly, as everybody has emphasized before me, we are speaking of logistics today in a time of pandemic. While we have stressed for several years now that supply chains, logistical corridors and hubs, ports and warehouses build the kind of skeleton of capitalist globalization with its own spatiality and even jurisdiction. The spread of the virus led, at least for a moment, to the paralysis of its operations. It was another 9/11 moment. And there is a need to ask what the present conjuncture has to say about the future of capitalist globalization. The notion of D Globalization circulates a lot in current discussions and has been recalled before. But my shorthand answer is that if we take seriously what I was saying before regarding logistics and capitalism, capitalism today is necessarily global capitalism. Having said this, there is a need to understand what global capitalism means, and there is a need to carefully analyze current trends in the reorganization of the logistical networks of capitalism, which include possible processes of regionalization. Second point, I have also been struck by the phrase essential workers that characterizes lockdowns in many parts of the world. And I also think that the pandemic was a moment of revelation. People have discovered that along with health workers, for instance, and mostly migrant farm workers, logistical workers in the widest meaning of the word form a large part of those quote and unquote essential workers. And there is a need to stress that from the warehouse workers to the riders employed in food delivery, logistical workers have been at the forefront of labor struggles in the last few weeks. Even migrant farm workers who went on strike in Italy 2 days ago, on May 21st, framed their demands, taking as counterpart not only agricultural bosses and the government, but also large-scale retailers, and adding an important logistical dimension to their struggle. I think this is important in itself, but also because logistical and other essential workers were the first to confront the alternative between the primacy of profit and the primacy of health that will shape class struggle in the next future in many parts of the world. Therefore, we have a lot to learn from their experiences and struggles. Third and last point, particularly considering the intensity of the mobilization of the riders, at least in Italy, and in particular in Bologna, the city where I am based, I would strongly suggest to include into our discussion the topic of platforms, which have further entrenched their grip on social relations during the lockdown and will definitely emerge as winners from the ensuing economic crisis. Platforms are a crucial field of struggle today. And let me just say to conclude that in Italy, we are confronted today with a burgeoning proliferation of mutualistic networks of mutual aid within social movements, who are, among other things, engaged in delivery and are experimenting with platform cooperativism in ways that are, in my opinion, highly interesting. precisely because they are connected with a dynamic of struggle. So I conclude on a similar note to Deborah, stressing the need to look at possible fields of convergence between labor struggles and let's say counter logistics, attempts to build counter infrastructures from within social movements. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandro. So I think after kind of these initial comments, it's worth kind of going through some of the questions that were asked by the panel. And I'm going to try to do some kind of synthesis work of two of those questions to get us going. So two of the questions were really interested in particular, looking at the oil industry in the way that Lale was talking about. In particular, I was interested in looking at what would happen in this context if large petrol companies go bankrupt and what happens to these petrol value chains. And the second was thinking largely about the ways in which those bankruptcies are being bailed out, in particular, as these fossil fuel companies have been bought up by private equity companies and largely loaded up with huge amounts of debt and over leveraged strategies that now make them more vulnerable as a whole to any economic downturn. But I wanted to also think about that question within the broader context of thinking about the role of logistics infrastructure in climate change. So the logistics sector in general has laid out immense amounts of fixed capital formation to develop the kind of ports and necessary infrastructure for capital accumulation. This kind of spatial regime of accumulation, the amount of huge amount of materials that are involved in this are all very carbon intensive. In general, to maintain the particular set of relationships of investments that have put down, it would continue us on a track towards climate devastation. Workers in the logistics sector are kind of in an interesting mix in this particular landscape. On one hand, they're kind of dependent on the logistics industry as a means of employment, but on the other are probably going to be perhaps most exposed, as we've seen during COVID, to any kind of crisis that is likely to take place. In general, what we're kind of seeing with oil as well as logistics is increasingly a capitalist class that's defending its own particular sets of investments, in particular financial capital, as it invests into the kind of built environment of logistics. So I was curious to opening up to kind of our panel in what way worker movements in the logistics sector can actually move towards or thinking about kind of labor movements and how it relates to climate change and thinking about decarbonizing the broader logistics economy. At Amazon, this question has been quite central for a group called Amazon Employees for Climate Justice. So Amazon Employees for Climate Justice is a group of tech workers that have been organizing for the last 2 years around Amazon's large carbon impact in the economy. A big effort of their organizing has led to Jeff Bezos to claim a climate pledge. And this climate pledge has essentially determined that Amazon will take the lead in capital investment to actually decarbonize the company on more aggressive targets than it was actually set by the Paris Accord. For the logistics economy, this looks a lot like electrification of automobiles, automation of electrified automobiles, which in turn also reproduce kind of imperial orders of mineral extraction and exploitation. So it's quite the knot about how worker movements in particular can think about the kind of climate crisis and how it relates as well to the particular economic crisis that we're in right now that's seeing kind of both the consolidation of capitalist class interests and kind of their ability to exercise their power to maintain the systems of which they've invested in. So Lale, I think it's worth starting with you on this question based on kind of thinking about oil and its relationship to logistics and kind of thinking about the underlying political economy that you were talking about, of the relationship between kind of these bankrupting companies, but the inability to actually then move towards new forms of capital investment that could actually move us towards a greener economy and kinds of more hopeful futures that you mentioned.
I mean, one of the things to mention is that with a lot of these fracking companies going bankrupt and being bought up by various asset stripping vultures, actually works to the benefit of an ExxonMobil. I mean, the very largest of the oil companies are, in particular in the US, where they have been competing against these independents that have been engaged in fracking rather than the traditional modes of extraction. Exxon is actually loving it. So in a way, it's important to acknowledge that while some oil companies are really getting hit, and for example, in Europe, Shell, for the first time since the Second World War, hasn't given dividends to, or has reduced the amount of dividends that it gives to its investors. Nevertheless, the biggest of the oil companies, which own concessions to oil fields all around the world, are not being hurt. So I think that's really important to acknowledge. The landscape might be shifting, but fossil fuel is still very central. The second question that you brought up, and I think it's really interesting to me, is how can there be a conjuncture between organizing around both bread and butter issues and environmental issues, while also acknowledging that there's a kind of a political context for this. And on this one, I have to say that I am not particularly optimistic. And part of the reason that I'm not optimistic is for exactly the reasons that both Charmaine and Deb so clearly laid out, that there are racial capitalism works through creation of hierarchies, both global and local, in which some people are considered to be more expendable, some people are considered to be more exploitable, some people are, you know, and so I think those kinds of racialized hierarchies also work to separate people out. And I suspect that when it comes to especially questions of environmental issue and whether or not we are going to consume and our consumption is going to support our jobs, elements of nationalist sentiment come into this, and I see it already happening. I see it happening from everything that I read about the US. I see it happening extensively in Europe, and I'm sure that it's also happening in places like China, and I know that it's also happening in the Middle East, where people are saying, well, you know what, if you want to go on ahead and do your environmental backup, we're trying to grow our economy back from whatever, because we're trying to save our jobs, because we want to be able to eat. And so a form of economic nationalism is emerging, which is actually not the positive anti-colonial forms that we recognize, but ones that are which are deeply self-protective. And in some places, they do acknowledge that, of course, in the US, people are the biggest consumers and producers of carbon. I mean, that's unquestionable, both in absolute terms and in per capita, in absolute terms and in per capita terms. But even setting aside the acknowledgement that the US still, as the global metropole, is one of the biggest producers of carbon, there are senses in which people are not going to join up across the borders on this question of environmental protection, marrying it up with labor protection. Not everywhere. I can see elements of that happening in, for example, in Canada and the US, in part because the kinds of political formations that are emerging there are separate from the sort of the nationalist formation. It's the stuff that Deb has been working with, and she can speak to this much more extensively than I can, but it's about sort of, for example, First Peoples, Indigenous peoples, getting together and organizing across the borders around the same sorts of issues, and not separating those things out from one another's. But in a lot of the rest of the world, particularly across the oceans, particularly in continental senses, those kinds of competitions, the sense of nationalist kind of hunkering down, unfortunately, is quite significant. Now, Sandra talked about maybe regionalization as a kind of a response to this, and that could potentially be something that works. But all of the regions that I look into, or I have looked at, also have their own contentious internal conflicts. And then you have also the same sorts of class and racialized conflicts and fissures everywhere that you go. And so in a sense, we need new modalities of organizing that don't revert back to these forms of nationalist mobilization, whether around labor or whatever.
I think you're muted.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting intervention, right? I think we kind of spoke about this a bit with Charmaine kind of brought up the different tensions that have emerged, in particular in kind of the counter-revolution of logistics as it started to dismantle kind of an alternative alternative political economic order. But I think this question around kind of economic nationalism is really tense in relationship to kind of the broader logistics economy. I was wondering, Deb, if you had any comments in relationship to kind of thinking about the ways in which First Nation movements, other kind of movements have been thinking about the relationship between kind of the logistics sector and kind of decarbonization.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, first, I mean, I think what Lale has laid out makes a lot of sense in much of the world and for many people. I do think that there is some important kind of limits to that in exactly the context she pointed to, but also in some of the social worlds that are, if not following Indigenous leadership, certainly looking to Indigenous movements as pointing in a direction that we all need to be moving. But I can just start by saying, as the pandemic hit, at least in the, when it started to become a matter of major concern in the North American and in the context I live and work, and I'll speak to Canada for a moment because it was at that time that we were facing, I would say, one of the most significant Indigenous jurisdiction, solidarity, sovereignty movements of recent memory, for sure. So some of you will have been following the RCMP, our national sort of very military police raid on the Wet'suwet'en territory in what's known as British Columbia. And the response that came not just from the Wet'suwet'en people, but from solidarity across the country, most notably the Mohawks, but groups, First Nations, Indigenous, Métis groups across the country, and non-Indigenous people who stood with them. And one of the most extraordinary things that started to take place was it turned into a movement that was called Shut Canada Down, or Shut Down Canada, depending on which hashtag you followed. And I mention this in some detail because it took its main form as a shutdown of railroad tracks, as the blockade, or as demonstrations, or sort of standoffs around railroad tracks. And there was a series of really extraordinary events that took place, including Mohawk people's teaching treaty to police officers over the railway tracks and doing ceremony at the railway tracks, while they also managed to maybe not shut down the Canadian economy, but certainly disable rail transport and significant parts of the Canadian economy. And part of what was really extraordinary in that context, it of course follows on massive struggles over pipelines, over residential schools and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, over what's going on in northern communities with housing crises and water crises, communities living for decades without access to clean water. But it managed to galvanize the support of almost half the Canadian population, which is, for an incredibly radical movement that was asserting Indigenous jurisdiction and challenging some very basic tenets of settler mentality, settler political economy, and settler state authority. That's pretty phenomenal. And of course, at the center of that movement was the protection of lands and waters, and the deliberate disruption of supply chain infrastructure. And I don't think those are accidental kinds of connections to our conversation today. There's lots of really cool writing about that. There's lots of resources online that you can find. But I did want to mention that because I think it's a feature of, we could see similar dynamics with the very, very, very significant Standing Rock events of a few years ago, which really shook not just the oil economy in the United States, but I think American political culture and global Indigenous kinds of cultures and solidarities and sovereignties as well. And so I guess one thing we can think about there is how the big exception to the distinction between kind of the bread and butter and environment that Lale was distinguishing is that for Indigenous peoples and within Indigenous movements, poverty does not mean a sacrifice of environment by and large. Of course, there's all kinds of complexities to that claim, but I think some of the most prominent Indigenous rights movements have been about protecting waters and lands and indigenous jurisdiction itself. So I think that that's not a minor exception to some of the comments that Lale made. And I think I would say that it's also inspiring, especially young people. You know, I teach a class of 800 first-year students every year, and I was teaching that class while both of these crises unfolded. And it was really interesting. And they're not students that are coming to get a radical education. They're mostly engineers and life science students. But it was really interesting, you know, trying to teach about these crises as they're unfolding. And I think in part because so many of them don't feel like they have a future, don't feel like there's a job market for them, don't see themselves being able to afford housing, that instead of a resistance to environmental arguments, the kind of like looming apocalypse that folks are seeing with the climate crisis actually seems even more significant and even more important to invest themselves in for any kind of future, not just a successful livelihood, but like a future itself. So I think those are significant differences. And of course, the Greta Thunberg kind of phenomenon I think marks some of that as well. The kind of younger people's willingness to take a gamble, to sort of put their lives on the line because they feel like they don't have alternatives anyhow. So I think one last thing I'll mention, you know, some of the work that Winona LaDuke and others are doing really does make an argument for not just bioregionalism as a kind of basis for economic futures, and especially like post-industrial, but also potentially post-supply chain capitalist futures, where someone like Winona is also really seriously thinking about intentional reindustrialization. And on the White Earth Reservation, she's involved in not only you know, building solar facilities, but also regenerating hemp industries as a new kind of materials culture and political economy. So I think that there's obviously the kind of reactionary nationalisms we're seeing, like, you know, with Trump and others, but there's also a radical and indigenous and really beautifully environmental argument for those kinds of movements away from these dramatically extended supply chains that I think Sandra was also speaking to.
Okay, so I'm going to return to some of the questions that other listeners have. So this question was directed for Deb, but for everyone, but in particular for Deb. And this person wrote, if I understand your point, supply line circulation capital compresses on the forces and policies of production like the pig through logistics as a management and material science. What other ways do you see logistics generalizing across capital social reproduction? Does this generalization open up opportunities for new socialist and communist strategies specific to the logistical economy?
That's a really big question and a really nice one. Thank you. I mean, what I was trying to do today was sketch some of the ways in which, if we just take like one sector, which has had so much attention for good reason during this crisis, you know, and most of the attention has been around this one part of the supply chain, which is the processing plants. You know, and I think even a tendency more broadly, even within the critical logistics literature, to still sort of think about like the Amazons and the, you know, IKEAs and the Home Depots, which is absolutely crucial. And there's, you know, that attention is well warranted. But I guess my concern is that it's sometimes still brought to the after everything is all made, and then how it gets places. And that's really, I think, you know, yes, we've seen more emphasis on transportation for sure. And, you know, we can go back to also volume 2 of Capital, like some of us do, and see that, you know, transportation is crucial as production in and of itself. But I think that, to me, what has been most challenging to wrap my head around, but also most important in terms of really taking this logistics counter-revolution seriously is to refuse to just see logistics as what happens after things are already made. And so I use the example of the pig because I think it precisely like makes us think about how logistics as a kind of logic of calculation, you know, there's different logics of calculation. I don't want to say that everything logistical is about exchange value, because there's beyond the kinds of alternative and radical forms of logistics that I think are also very much abundant and out there and worth us maybe thinking and talking about. There's also just military models that are not always organized around profit maximization. They might have a different operative, although those are also hard to separate as well. But I guess what I was trying to suggest is that what we really need to think about is how those logics remake the very terrain, the very commodities, the very social forms, and especially the spatial forms that we inhabit. And so the question is sort of like, I'm kind of, in a sense, repeating the question. I think I've tried to, in a longer forum of my last book, I tried to sort of point out how this transformation in the economy and security has been one of the key features of that. And especially, like, I spent a lot of time in that book thinking about the ways in which our very sense of borders, of security, what does national security, for instance, mean in the context of supply chain capitalism? I think it's a very different project. I want to open it up, though, and hear other people on this, because I feel like I've already said quite a bit, and maybe I'll have other thoughts as others are speaking to ruminate. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so one question that has come up now through several iterations is kind of thinking about what the prospects for coordinating labor organizing along supply chains and for building class solidarity between disparate communities. An example given here is perhaps between metropoles and hinterlands internationally, and thinking about coordinated labor movements, or examples like Deb was bringing up between, say, Indigenous First Nation movements and ILWU workers who work the railroads or work the ports, around kind of struggles around issues around social reproduction and the economy. So I think this question, Charmaine, I'd love to hear your particular perspectives of thinking through this kind of question of class composition today, right? So we've heard, of course, in the media that there's going to be these large strikes at Instacart and Amazon and, across the logistics economy. But the reality is, when it came to those particular strikes, they were largely media spectacles more so than they were kind of disruptive labor actions. If we actually look at this kind of in the face, it kind of demonstrates that despite the fact that there's increased militancy and desire for strikes, the actual development of class organization, in particular within the logistics economy, is still completely inadequate to actually facilitate mass strikes that are capable of disruptive power. And at the same time, there's also some really interesting developments that are starting to happen as struggles are starting to interlink together, as new organizations are developing within these spaces. So again, what comes to mind for me is an Amazon work of thinking of the connection between warehouse and tech workers, the cross-occupational lines, and increasing an international warehouse movement, which is developed as a result of Amazon's globalization and reproducing its same workplaces and same work conditions around the globe. So you've seen the development of Amazon Workers International, which connects Polish workers, Spanish workers, Mexican and US workers, Canadian workers together into kind of a new formation of organization as a result of capital's expansion. These are still very early in its development. So Charmaine, I was wondering if you could comment kind of in thinking about the potential for linking together struggles across the supply chain and where your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I can start, but I think all of us have thought a lot about these questions. So I'd be really thrilled to hear from Sandro and others as well. I guess I'll just say that, one thing I've been thinking about is the way that there tends to be, I think, in especially the leftist literature around the potentials for logistics organizing, this tendency to make a split, right, between, on the one hand, people like Charlie Post and Joe Allen, who say it is time for the renewal of an industrial sector where we double down on workplace organizing in the logistics sector as a sort of specific and strategic way of building worker power. And I think that that's absolutely right. But one thing that, and then on the other side, of course, people I think like Clover, the Invisible Committee, who are thinking more capaciously, I think, about circulation struggles as something that exceeds the industrial strike and might actually move towards other forms of organizing. And one thing I think I've been finding really helpful, and this is something that I've learned actually from you, Spencer, in your organizing and in Amazon organizing, the ways in which the supply chain or thinking about logistics actually helps us to rather than think about these as a binary, think about them in cooperation with each other, right? That what we've seen with the Amazon network, for example, and with public actions, is that the industrial strategy of striking in the Amazon workplace dovetails with calls for worker empowerment through calls for dense and affordable social housing, mass transit, a Green New Deal that is focused on and empowers workers rather than one that's fixed on corporate profits, and one that sort of binds tech workers and other workers together. But one, I think, framework that I've been finding really productive lately is the way that Amanda Armstrong Price has, in an excellent review of Joshua Clover's book, Right, Straight, Riot, actually sort of tries to think about precisely this kind of binary, right, between the proletarian industrial struggle versus the kind of mass riot outside of the factory itself. And she suggests that actually it might be helpful to think about workers who are not striking in their workplace as what she terms unsituated proletarians or dispossessed proletarians. And I find that term really helpful, right? Because it's not as if people who are in solidarity with Amazon workers and striking or helping to blockade Amazon warehouses with car caravans, or it's not as if people who block ports but they don't work at ports are not proletarians, right? They're simply not proletarians in the site of the workplace that is doing the choke pointing or bottlenecking work. And so unsituated proletarians might actually open up a terrain for us to think about strategies of the strike and the riot together as things that sort of converge on spaces of transit, like the ones that Deb has pointed out, in ways that are sort of specifically about, restoring power to the kinds of workers and class and race positions that racial capitalism has taken away. And maybe just to sort of finish off, one thing that David Stein's work has taught me is that in the 1970s, in a moment that I think reflects ours, what we're seeing right now is a sort of massive unemployment, right? And in the 1970s, there was a sort of turning point where the problem of rebellious surplus populations was met also at the same time with a call for guaranteed jobs, a call that I think we need more and more today, right? With the sort of massive unemployment of the pandemic. And one of the turns that happened in the 1970s is that as the call for guaranteed jobs were being made, various kinds of, especially in the US, monetary policy was used to try to undo that call. And at the same time, amidst this, police and prisons were also being proffered as solutions to the rising problem of jobs, right? So rather than provide people with jobs, police and punish them in ways that cage populations that should be provided for in different kinds of ways. So it feels like we are also at the precipice of such a movement where if we see the kind of terrain of struggle, right, to corporations and governments who are going to restructure over workers' heads, we are in real trouble. And I think supply chains are one way of sort of capaciously opening up space for us to think about unsituated proletarians and the kinds of calls we can make today for things like guaranteed jobs.
So you were talking about inadequate forms of class organization in logistics. Maybe, in a way, forms of class organization are always inadequate. But if I look for a moment at Italy, in the last 5 years, we have been witnessing an amazing continuity of struggles and strikes in logistical warehouses. I think it has been the most important and radical chapter in class struggle in Italy in the last 5 years. And it has also prompted the emergence of new self-organized unions. At the same time, there have been struggles and strikes in wholesale markets, for instance. There have been important struggles and strikes, the last one 2 days ago, as I was saying before, in agriculture. migrant workers in agriculture have gone on strike and have blamed immediately big retailers, connecting labor struggle for migrants' rights and logistics. So I think it's a quite rich picture of struggles and forms of self-organization in logistics related to logistics. My sense is that the problem is maybe another. We are talking about supply chain capitalism. Many people use the phrase logistical capitalism. We all agree on the fact that logistics is crucial in contemporary capitalism. So there are many people, scholars as well as activists, who say, well, logistics is the new automotive industry. As the automotive industry was at the center of Fordism and of class struggle in Fordism, logistics necessarily is at the center of struggles in contemporary capitalism. But I think that there is a fundamental difference between, let's say, Fordist capitalism and contemporary capitalism. A general strike in General Motors or in Fiat was really immediately having societal implications. This is not necessarily the case with logistical struggles nowadays. Many of the logistical struggles I have mentioned before have remained completely isolated within the warehouses, notwithstanding their radical nature. So I think the main question we should ask is which are the tools that we need in order to multiply the power of logistical struggles, in order to open up spaces of convergence between logistical struggles and other kind of struggles, including the environmentalist struggles that you were mentioning before. I think for me, this is a really important, question, and this isolation of logistical struggles, not every logistical struggle. I'm talking about the specific logistical struggles that remained isolated within warehouses. And I think that this isolation effect is part and parcel of the working of the supply chain.
Deb or Lolly, did you have anything specific you would like to add to thinking about kind of this articulation of struggles along supply chains or the prospect of it?
I mean, I find it quite interesting that the Europeans here are a little bit more pessimistic about the ways that these things work. And I think in part it is precisely because of what Deb talked about, is that the forms of struggle that we're seeing happening in the US along infrastructures, along various supply chains are already interwoven with other forms of struggle that reach into other spaces, whether these are the First Nations struggling to maintain some control over their land, or coming up with new ways of doing things, as you mentioned, with, for example, deindustrializing within the reservations and coming up with, for example, agriculture, hemp and solar and things like that. And so I think that and Charmaine has been involved in other forms of activism that also reached out beyond, for example, the port space into the communities of activists. So I wonder to what extent these forms of kind of exciting happenings that seem to be happening in the Western Hemisphere, what is it about them specifically that doesn't necessarily translate to the European context, or in the cases that I look at, when I look at the Middle East, for example, there are many instances of incredibly brave people striking on ports or trying to do work stoppage or whatever, but because there are forms of political repression that stop any kind of activity, the ability to reach beyond, and also, of course, the massive divide between migrant workers and citizens, it becomes really very difficult to reach beyond the port space and do that kind of overcoming the border, the boundary that Sandro is talking about. So to me, that's actually an interesting puzzle. Why are such possibilities seem so much more doable, so much more real right now in the Western Hemisphere and in North America, but also in instances in South America? Whereas I look at Europe right now and I see a turn inward. I see a really quite alarming rise of the right in very institutional forms, not just the kinds of idiots that one can see on the streets, and a kind of a foreclosure of the possibilities of reaching out beyond radical workspaces. So that's what I would love to hear from both Charmaine and Deb about, because I would like to know what accounts for that transoceanic difference.
Thanks, Lily. I'm surprised and a little curious as to how you saw my thoughts as optimistic, or I mean, maybe that is. I think I certainly do in my work and in my being try and look for possibility. But I came close to calling this, I think, quite, like I was saying, gruesome political economy and form of socio-spatial control, a kind of new logistical spatial fix. I don't like, as much as I'm invested in and always trying to contribute to and open up possibility, I actually don't, like the moment where I saw a lot of possibility early on in the quarantine and in the unfolding of the coronavirus here, and at least in this geography, was when there seemed to be some kinds of meaningful, like I sort of gestured at, meaningful commitments to this category of essential worker, and the essential worker sort of displacing critical infrastructure as we're used to seeing its kind of militarized, hyper-capitalist forms. And I thought, oh, there's like this really interesting opening here. But I think that idea that this we're in this together and we're going to somehow transform, like use value is going to conquer all because life and health seems to somehow be I think that disappeared so quickly as soon as middle and upper class people could get their supplies, realize that they were going to be able to access Amazon and toilet paper and Whole Foods and whatever else they're ordering into their homes, and that of course is, like, to me, the whole an anchoring of this particular, at least temporary kind of spatiality to this logistical quarantine. So
if I can jump in, the optimism
Please.
that I'm talking about is precisely about those First Nations struggles that you were talking about, which
Yeah.
were actually effective, which were actually disruptive, which did actually get people behind them. Now, whether or not they will result in meaningful transformation of certain structures is something to be seen, but they were both in Canada and in the US, they were significant movements, and
For sure.
they did reach out, and I think that that's something that is very distinct, and as you pointed out, reaches out across the work or social reproduction boundary, reaches out across the indigenous peoples or First Nations and this settler community, the immigrant community, whatever. And it reaches out also across racial boundaries, actually, I think, or hardened boundaries of racialization. And I think that that's what's so exciting about that, which again, I find, I think Sandro mentioned activist groups that work with immigrants and workers. And I think that in Europe is probably the one possible similar thing that we're seeing. So in particular in the Mediterranean countries, in France and Italy, in Spain, we're seeing activists that are really radically breaking the law in order to bring immigrants in. And then they're also involved with all sorts of other movements that have to do with that. But those are quite small and distinctive, incredibly amazing. But to me, they also seem to be not quite as transformative, not quite as huge, not expansive. And so I'm curious about how to expand these movements from these kinds of points of light in all sorts of places. How do we turn that into a spotlight, into a massive kind of, floodlight?
Yeah, no, for sure. I absolutely agree with what you said about the possibility. And I think that comes down to like the extraordinary, like the courageous, the bold, the incredibly visionary politics and survivalism, and also persistence of indigenous struggle, like the indigenous peoples themselves who have, who just, kept fighting, and that it's both inspiring, the kind of style of politics, but it also, I think, like you're absolutely right, the intransigence is really extraordinary and has built incredible multiracial and cross territorial kinds of alliances. Maybe I'll just like flag one thing in what Sandra said, because I think it's really crucial, and then I'll sort of pass the hat to Charmaine. And that was where you left off, Sandra, around kind of containment and separation and isolation. And I think, I would certainly not be the first to comment on the fact that the ironies of a system like logistics and supply chain that's so supposedly committed to connection and integration being so premised on separation. And of course, that's one of the key distinctions there is between human and especially worker movement and connection and the movement of commodities. But I do really think that that's crucial, and I really did want to emphasize questions of bordering and containment. And I think, the migrant worker question here as well is one that is so extraordinary, and there's been amazing organizing by a whole bunch of migrant rights groups in this region, by groups like the Caribbean Solidarity Network, around the Caribbean migrants that are coming here to do agricultural work in Ontario and Southern Ontario, as well as other parts of Canada. And the kind of conditions that are usually quite abhorrent, but that are in the context of the pandemic even more outrageous. And I think part of what allows that to happen is, of course, the separations and isolations and the making invisible of the populations that do so much of that crucial work. I do think that that is still one of the possibilities of this moment, right? That the pandemic does at least make visible some of what is often hidden in terms of supply, in terms of the everyday labor that goes into making social reproduction and provisioning possible. So, Charmaine, over to you. How are you optimistic living in the heart of one of the beasts?
I'm not, actually. The other day, Mazen Laban signed off an email to me saying, "Hope without faith." And I thought that captured quite tragically, but also brilliantly, how I feel in this moment, that we have to fight and there's no choice but that what we've seen is the state constantly restructuring. But I don't want to end on that note. I maybe want to just sort of briefly say, right, this kind of question of why it is that we've seen sort of such capacious articulations of struggle along logistical lines in the North American context. One, we could go back to this kind of argument, right, that we are increasingly seeing the precaritization of jobs, so that it's not really workplaces anymore that are the kind of spaces where people feel either that they, in the sense of identity, belong, right, as a working class, but also that it's harder to organize when the gigification and the precaritization of the economy makes it harder and harder to do so, particularly with the decimation of union labor, right, which is very different between Europe and the US. So there's, I think, that historical context. But the other two, and I think you, Deb and Lale and Sandra have already pointed to this, the other is just that I think, movements have taught us how to bridge these struggles. I mean, from as early as the Black Panthers thinking capaciously about the relations between race and class, to the Combahee River Collective thinking about identity politics as something that's rooted in material international intersectional struggle. The way that I've learned that we have to think beyond sort of purely class versus racial struggles is that we have no choice to do that, because capitalism and race were never separate things anyway, right? C.L.R. James, in fact, calls slaves the early modern proletariat. And I think we have to think in the terms of never understanding, struggles that are sort of in the terrain of anti-racist politics and struggles in the terrain of workerist politics as ever separate. But maybe I'll just stop there. And I know Spencer has a question sort of in this realm as well. So maybe we can go back to that.
No, but I did have kind of one comment of thinking about Lale's question of how we expand this movement, right? And I think Charmaine just pointed very well that there's just been a complete decimation of the working class in the United States. There's been a systematic attack of 40 years on working class institutions such as unions and working class communities through transformations in the labor process. And I think we're actually at the beginning, right, of kind of new labor formations that are emerging, as well as new strategies that are starting to be developed. In particular, there's a growing left and a growing active sense of organization building, building both political parties on the left that can advance struggle on the political terrain, as well as economic organization. So a new union formation across the United States has obviously been picking up since 2017. That's been organizing in white collar work as well as blue collar work. But it's really in this massive transformation, and kind of in our experience organizing at Amazon, there's a lot of people that have an active interest in wanting to organize and change their workplace, but the means to actually do so has never been part of their material experience. They've never been part of a union, have never organized in a rental complex, have never organized in their workplace. So most people don't have any experience on how to actually organize and develop effective organization. And this is also combined by the fact that we have left institutions that in general have failed to actually develop deep organizing and deep organizing strategies in their efforts to kind of build working class organization in workplaces. So I think this relates to Sandra's point earlier that within Italy, we've actually seen the formation of new unions that are coming up. They're developing a much more aggressive stance towards militancy at work, in particular, building mass strikes, seeking to seize control of the labor process itself, develop worker control over the process of work that has been so controlled and dominated by capital. But I think what we're seeing, what Charmaine was also gesturing towards, is that as people are starting to organize, we're drawing on our historical mentors and movements in the past to think about these concrete questions. But as organization develops, it enables the ability for these things to link together that wasn't possible even 3 years ago. So it's the actual development now in the recomposing of the working class as it builds its new organizational capacity to actually link these struggles together, rather than kind of the more activist orientation of politics that was kind of divorced from the working class for the last 10, 15 years. So I think we're at the very beginning of that stage, and kind of the working class is starting to compose itself in new ways. And there's very different, I don't know that, I'm really interested in hearing more historically about kind of why we're seeing this more in North America versus kind of the, decline of the left in Europe. And but I think that's one way of thinking about these particular questions.
I shouldn't generalize to the whole of Europe. I think we're just in a really kind of a grim moment in the UK. And so maybe that's also partially why I'm reflecting on this. I always think that the Mediterranean, Southern European countries, France has had this massive kind of mobilization for the last however long. And so there's a lot more stuff going on in the Southern Mediterranean. I think my sense of depression comes from being in the UK.
Yeah,
I'm depressed too, Lale. It's okay.
Just a couple of words on France, since Lale mentioned the mobilization of the last couple of years. I think it is quite interesting to think about the yellow vest from a logistical point of view. And it is quite easy to do that because the question of transport and mobility has been since the beginning at the center of the movement. Of a movement that assembled around the roundabout in the periphery of the big cities, precisely posing the question of the logistical connection between the periphery and the city. And just one more note about the yellow vest. It is also interesting to think about the yellow vest from the point of view of environmentalism, because the beginning of the movement was a mobilization against an environmental tax that disproportionately hit the working classes. So at the beginning, there was this kind of insurgency against an environmental tax. But in the development of the movement, it has really opened up a new political space, particularly through this kind of invention of the political form of the assembly of assemblies. And within this assembly of assemblies, the discussion about environmental question has been really amazing. I mean, and the movement has become, the movement of the Yellow Vest has become a kind of a point of reference for the discussion of environmental questions in France. I think it is quite interesting to reflect upon such questions.
All right, well, if I may, it is Saturday afternoon. I think it's worth finishing with one last question so we can then get on with the rest of our weekend, if the days still matter to you. For most of us, they don't.
It's 11 p.m. Yeah.
Or let Sandra go to bed.
Not really. I cannot go clubbing because clubs are closed, you know.
So the kind of question that I think is important is thinking about kind of moving logistics and logistics research outside of academia and thinking about how we can start to connect kind of the growing logistics research community with organizing efforts that are developing on the ground, or other kind of really material questions to help situate. I think we have such influential people here that are shaping these questions. I'm really curious about how you see about moving kind of logistics research out into, operationalize it into kind of left movements and kind of the political space today. Charmaine, as the resident activist scholar, not saying that.
Oh no, it's not just me. Everyone here is an activist scholar.
You are absolutely right. But as my personal friend who is AFO also.
Well, I suppose I can start and say a couple of things. I think that on the one hand, logistics research is crucial to, one, narrativizing these kinds of links and analytically helping us understand what the transformation of supply chains yields in terms of thinking about struggle in the ways that Deb and Lale and Sandra's work has done. So that's about the sort of the telling of the story, right? And I see RedMay panels like this as moments for us to actually help frame supply chain struggles as global, as internationalist, and as necessarily anti-racist. But I think on the other, there's also, I think, two less sexy maybe ways that I would like to close off. One is that I think we have this immense need for corporate research and the ways in which supply chains are shifting, the ways in which financial investments are shifting, right? So Lale's done incredible work on this with oil and commodity futures. But one of the things that Spencer and I were talking about earlier this week is the way that Blackstone, one of these private equity firms, is now investing up to a third of its portfolio in industrial warehouse space because it sees it as a kind of growing forefront of e-commerce. And the other side of its investment portfolio has been a $20 billion deal inked with the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince to build infrastructure investments or fund an infrastructural investment fund, which they are forecasting as sort of part of Trump's infrastructure plan, right? So I think corporate research that helps us, corporate strategic research that helps us identify these targets, how we might write about them is crucial. And then I think the third is that, I think a lot about the internationalization and globalization of supply chains, but I'm also situated and sited in Santa Barbara, California, where supply chains are not necessarily sort of at the forefront, right? The Port of LA is 2 hours away. But one thing I want to maybe just plug is that I think the work of doing this big picture analytical thinking is also, I think, grounded for most of us in the kinds of everyday struggles and work that we're doing in our own places, right? So in the University of California system, the wildcat strike by graduate workers, I think plays into some of these logistical logics that I won't have time to go into right now, but the kind of increasing control of graduate workers, for me, it's helped me to bridge the kind of organizing work that I do with them to the work that I'm thinking about. And the last is that, I think even as we're talking about sort of the necessity of not sort of seeing worker struggles and unsituated proletarian struggles outside of it as binaries, there's also, I think, a great need to start identifying the kinds of workplaces where we can do the hard, slow, boring work, right, of organizing and mobilizing people. And so a kind of last plug is just, if anyone is interested in organizing against Amazon, which I think is one of the biggest behemoths and challenges of logistics firms today, please get in touch with either me or Spencer, who are doing some of this work, and we can connect you.
Okay, I'll go because no one else jumped. Maybe just to add one thing to what Charmaine said. I mean, Blackstone is so big that they're pretty much in everything, everything bad too. But Blackstone is also like one of the main financial entities involved in like buying up foreclosed housing in the US, and I think one of the things we can really think about is, in the relationship between work and housing, which is what shapes most people's lives, not just work. The housing crisis is so severe that your wages can mean almost nothing. Even increases can mean almost nothing, depending what's happening in terms of the financialization of the rental market. So I think, those kinds of connections, and I think better research on a places like Blackstone, entities like Blackstone that is so vast, would be really crucial. Just briefly, a couple things just to pick up on what Charmaine said, but hopefully also to answer your question, Spencer, and to wrap up. One of the reasons I decided to sort of do what I did today, which was to not just talk directly about the sectors that we would think about, like Amazon workers that are so important, but to sort of push for an expansive kind of way of thinking about logistics in this moment, is in part because there's I've been really delighted to see so many, especially like labor scholars, but also labor organizers, whether or not they take up the language of logistics does not really matter to me, but they're certainly working on questions that are about logistics and supply chain capitalism. So there was an event a couple of days ago with Juan Delara, Steve Tufts, and others. Sorry, I'm not remembering everyone's names, but some amazing organizers from the Warehouse Workers Center, which is a new creation here in the Greater Toronto region, which is like most big cities now, a large proportion of the economy is logistics and supply chain. I heard a figure that Peel, which is a region, it's like one of the suburban but very large regions, which is also mostly people of color at this point and new immigrants, is now 40-some% of their economy is in warehousing and supply chain. This is becoming increasingly common. And I think between those shifts in reality and the growing kind of like the pandemic, for instance, making so clear how important those parts of the economy are in terms of everyday survival, that could have not, it certainly wasn't hidden to those in those workforces, but for those who were just receiving stuff at their front door, maybe a little easier to ignore. So one of the reasons I decided to move where I did is because there has been more, I think, research, more organizing, at least in some of the worlds I travel, and including in important ways to some of the kinds of connections that Charmaine is insisting on, that we don't just think of isolated kind of labor or class struggles, but we're always thinking intersectionally and transnationally in these ways. And one other thing, I think even in the context of the university, like when we were having a big strike here on our campus, Martin Daniluk, another critical logistics nerd and friend, of ours, we were talking about actually writing something about the kind of logistics of strike action and counter actions from the university. You know, how do you close off campuses, and how, for instance, the building of a new subway line from the downtown to York University campus, another university in Toronto, that has been limited by being dependent on buses, which get stuck in traffic, and recently got a subway stop after many years of anticipation. But one of the first consequences of that in some of our minds was that it was really hard to maintain a picket line when the subway comes under and through your picket line, whereas surface transit was much easier to control in terms of maintaining a picket line. So I think I guess this is sort of what I'm pushing for as well, more broadly, as much as I'm thrilled that there's a lot of take up of these fields and these questions, but to see logistics in spaces that aren't necessarily obviously logistical, while we also still think about ports and warehouses and trains and all of that, we also look at how so many sites, sectors, and spaces are being remade through logics of supply chain capitalism, and keep supporting more investigation and action there. So thanks very much. It's been really fun being here.
Lale, you're muted.
I had unmuted myself, but okay. So I was going to say, I'm going to just jump in very quickly. I work on the Middle East, where the conditions of organization, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula, or most of the countries of Arabian Peninsula, with the exception of Yemen, are so incredibly difficult. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do, and I have been incredibly happy to see that when I give talks or when people read the book, actually find it interesting in the region itself, is the recuperation of a history of organizing that has been forgotten. Because I think that one of the things that has happened, and I think, Spencer, you pointed to that as well. You said that we have lost some of the ways in which we know how to organize. We have to find new repertoires, but there's also an entire long history and set of experiences that have been kind of disrupted and so forgotten. And one of the things that I was struck by is that in places that today are considered to be sort of the dream world of capitalists, because they have absolutely banned labor mobilizing and unionization and strikes and all sorts of things, there is an incredibly rich history of that organizing, and that history has been completely lost. No, it hasn't been lost, because there are lots of people who remember that, but it's by and large forgotten, or it's remembered in snippets, remembered in oral histories, remembered in conversations, but not in a systematic way. And so part of what I wanted to do was just to recuperate that. I think that's also really important. We need that kind of a multi-generational transmission, not only to learn, but also to adapt it, to change it, maybe even to completely and totally renounce it if we need to, but we need that history. And that's for me. And thank you so much for a great conversation all.
Well, just a couple of observations from my part. As I was saying at the beginning, I think we should, first of all, take seriously the challenge implied in the notion of D Globalization. I am convinced that this notion is kind of ideological, but nevertheless, it points at transformations that are reshaping the world in which we live. And I think that this is a major challenge for logistics, for supply chain capitalism. The hypothesis that I was presenting before is the hypothesis of processes of regionalization, conflict-ridden regionalization. I think what Lale said before is particularly important. There is no region in the world nowadays free of conflicts and tensions. Nevertheless, I think we should explore this idea of a regionalization of supply chain capitalism, global capitalism, of the logistical skeleton of global capitalism. Needless to say, we have also to look at the ways in which different world regions are and will continue to be connected with each other. For me, it is particularly interesting, also from a political point of view, to look at Europe from this angle. Will Europe be able to emerge as a kind of integrated logistical region? In a way, the process of European integration started as a logistical process. But nowadays, the situation is quite complex. A second point that is particularly important for me is the question of migration and borders. And I am convinced that a logistical gaze on migration and borders is particularly productive. I have written a couple of essays with my German friend Manuela Boyagiev, and I would like to go on testing this hypothesis of the productivity of a logistical gaze on migration and borders. A third and last point, that is for me always the most important, has to do with struggles. With the kind of struggles we are confronted with today in and around logistics. And I repeat, I agree with Deb, we need to combine labor struggles and, to put it with a shorthand phrase, counter logistics, the invention of, let's say, autonomous infrastructures. From this point of view, I am currently discussing with the Riders Union in Bologna that has promoted several strikes over the last weeks and months. And they have the project to launch a kind of a cooperative platform. From a theoretical point of view, I see all the limits of platform cooperativism, but I am convinced that this particular initiative is very interesting because it is connected with the dynamic of struggle. And so I will support this initiative. I will try to help them within a more general kind of reflection upon urban infrastructures in the wake of COVID-19. Thank you very much for this wonderful and inspiring conversation.
All right. I think one thing that I would add is extremely important right now, in particular for all of us unsituated proles who are bouncing in and out of grad school during this economic crisis, is worker inquiry. Also, you don't have to be in grad school to do worker inquiry or to do research or to be an academic. But worker inquiry right now is more important than ever in terms of being able to go out and understand not just workplace conditions, but also conditions around social reproduction, understanding kind of the linkages and life experiences of workers in and out of logistics spaces. Those worker inquiries are not only extremely important for understanding class composition, class organization, but also are very important in building up the relationships that also help expand organizing efforts. So worker inquiry that's like deeply situated in learning with communities and working class communities is super important. And all in all, like this was a really exciting and generative and really lucky to be able to help moderate and listen to a bunch of brilliant minds talk about some crucial issues today. So thank you, Philip, for organizing Red May.
Oh, thank you.
Hand it back
Thank
over
you,
to you.
everybody. And I have one yellow vest question for everybody. Everyone in France who drove a car had to have a yellow vest with them. So evidently all anybody had to do if they wanted to join the yellow vest was pick something they had and just show up. They didn't have to sign up with the DSA or do anything. What do we have that could function as a yellow vest, as a sign that anybody can pick up and say, I'm part of this, let's go out and meet? Is there anything?
Red berets or all black leather outfits.
Well, I mean, I guess the answer is,
was it a literal question?
It is in a way. I mean, there probably isn't anything, it's not a question of designing something that people can have. It's that everybody had this thing in their car, that they had to have with them. And I keep asking that question to see if someone will come up with something that we've never thought of, that we have, that could become part of something. Anyway, I'll leave that as a go away question. And I'll know if you've solved it because people will start wearing it all the time to demos as they show up. So thank you, Lale and Spencer and Sandro and Deb and Charmaine. It was a wonderful discussion. And thank you all Red May viewers for watching this. I'd like to say that if you signed up on YouTube, subscribe to us, and we got just 200 more subscribers, I think it was, we would get live captioning to make Red May more accessible. So just a reminder, if you haven't done that, do that. It'll help us do it. And come back at 6 p.m. for political economy of COVID-19. And also go to our www.redmayseattle.org and click donate. We need your money. We are 3,000 now, but we've got a few more thousand to get. So thank you very much and have a good day.